Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Here is our problem. In order to be able to address our increasingly complex social and economic and environmental challenges, we increasingly need to collaborate. This means that we increasingly need to work with people who we don't know or understand or trust. And at the same time, we find it increasingly difficult to collaborate. This is because our social structures are becoming increasingly stretched, fragmented, and polarized. So we face an increasingly wide gap between what we need to do and what we are able to do. How can we solve this problem? I've spent the last 20 years trying to answer this question. As Sanyi said, I am a partner in an organization that works with teams of leaders, teams made up of people from government and business, civil society, who are working together to try to address their... No, this is correct. Yes, thank you. I know how to... So almost nobody knows that the B key blanks the screen. A hidden and wonderful feature of PowerPoint. Working to address their most complex social and economic and environmental challenges. We've done this work on many different challenges in many different countries. I started to do this work over 20 years ago in South Africa. At the time, I was still working for Shell, and I was invited to assist a group of leaders that was trying to think about the future of the country. Nelson Mandela had just been released from prison, but the first democratic elections were not for several years later, and they were trying to to work together to find a way through a situation and a conflict and a complexity that most people, both internationally and in South Africa, considered could not be addressed peacefully. And on my first trip to South Africa in September 1991, I heard a joke which has always stuck with me because it exemplifies precisely both the challenge and the opportunity of this work. The joke was that faced with our dauntingly complex and difficult challenges, we actually have only two options. There's a practical option and there's a miraculous option. The practical option would be that we would all right now get out of our chairs and down on our knees, and we would pray for a band of angels to come and solve this problem for us. The miraculous option is that we would continue to argue and talk and fight amongst ourselves and to find a way forward that way. And this struck me as such an encapsulation of the potential of collaboration and its seeming impossibility. To everybody's surprise, not the least of it to the South Africans themselves, they succeeded in implementing this version of a miraculous solution. And this experience, this first experience, has inspired me for all the time since. And I've worked in this way over these last 20 years in Colombia on the peace process involving the government and business and civil society and all of the armed groups, on sustainable food supply chains in Europe and the Americas, working with food companies and NGOs and governments, in India on child malnutrition, working not just with communities and NGOs, but with government departments and corporations, in my home country of Canada, with different groups attempting to make a way forward on climate change. Last year, with the Organization of American States and under a mandate from all the 34 member countries of the OAS on seeing if there was a different way to look at and to pursue the so-called war on drugs. A lot of time over the past few years with electricity companies and environmentalists and technology innovators on the question of how to accelerate the implementation of renewable and distributed electricity sources, and then finally these last months in Thailand on the seemingly intractable political and social and economic conflict. What all of these experiences have in common is in every case they involved a team of leaders from across the social system in question working together, not simply to try to adapt to what was going on, but to try to transform the system of which they are part. And the great advantage of working on one question over and over for 20 years is you have lots of opportunity for trial and lots of opportunity for error, and so lots of opportunity for learning. And what I wanted to share with you this afternoon is what I have observed and what I have learned from these 20 years. My first observation is that we increasingly need to collaborate. And the way I have come to think about this is based on a particular way of describing complexity that was put forward by Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer some years ago, which referred to complex systems being complex in three different ways, which have three different implications. They talked about dynamic complexity, the extent to which cause and effect are far apart in space and time. This is the kind of complexity we're used to thinking about. The point about working on situations characterized by low dynamic complexity is we can make progress by working on the situation or the problem piece by piece. But situations of high dynamic complexity can only be addressed by working with, or at least attending to, the system as a whole. So therefore, what is required in order to deal with problems characterized by high dynamic complexity is to collaborate at a larger scale, to collaborate with actors far away in space and perhaps in time. The second kind of complexity that they talk about is generative complexity, the extent to which the situation is unfamiliar and unpredictable. Situations characterized by low generative complexity can be dealt with by applying existing best practice, by trying to figure out what was the last time we dealt with this, or the last time somebody dealt with this, and how did they make progress. But situations characterized by high generative complexity can only be effectively dealt with by finding a way forward as we go, by developing emerging practice. And the implication of high generative complexity is that collaboration is required in order with others to discover a way to mitigate the risk of the generative complexity. The third type of complexity, which is often the one that hits us in the face, is the extent to which different actors in the system have different perspectives and interests. Situations of low social complexity can be dealt with by turning the problem over to experts or authorities. But problems of high social complexity can only be dealt with by involving the actors or the stakeholders themselves, unless you want to deal with them from above or outside violently. And the implication of this third kind of complexity is collaboration is required in the sense of involving actors from across the system, including actors that we don't understand, that we don't know, and that perhaps we don't trust. The reason I have always found this framework to be helpful is my observation of what's going on in the world is that we increasingly frequently face situations characterized by high complexity on all three dimensions. And therefore, we increasingly infrequently are able to achieve our objectives working on our own or working unilaterally or attempting to get what we want by winning over other actors. And we see this over and over, but surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, as you'll see in a minute, this fact or this pattern is often not recognized. I mentioned that I worked a lot last year with the Organization of American States, which these last few days has been facing a real crisis with the violent conflict which has erupted in Venezuela. And I was very interested by a press release made a few days ago by Jose Miguel Insulza, the Secretary General of the OAS, where he said, I think quite correctly, neither victory nor defeat is an option. Victory sounds more heroic than agreement, but agreement is the only way forward. My second observation is that we find it increasingly difficult to collaborate. And I'd like to offer you a simple model to explain this observation. I was reading the paper which was recommended to us in advance of this conference, Warren Weaver's paper on science and complexity, and it contains a sentence which I think is extremely helpful, except that it is missing one letter. The sentence right in the middle of the paper, he's talking about what he called organized complexity. He says, problems of organized complexity involve dealing simultaneously with a sizable number of factors which are interrelated into an organic whole. However, I think this is not quite correct. I think what is more important is we're dealing with a sizable number of factors that are integrated into multiple organic wholes, plural. And it is the plurality of organic wholes which explains very simply why we find it increasingly difficult to collaborate. The way I look at social systems is as composed of nested holons. A holon is an entity which is a whole in itself and also part of a larger whole. I am a whole in myself and part of the group in this room. This group is a whole in itself and part of what's going on at the university, etc., etc. And if we want to understand the behavior of social systems, it's important to recognize, or I would suggest that it is helpful to recognize, that every social holon has two drives. And I'm going to use some very difficult technical terms to describe these two drives. I do this with some hesitation. The two terms I would like to use are power and love. When I was finishing my book, which has the title of Power and Love, A Theory and Practice of Social Change, one of my friends said, you really can't use these two words. They're really, neither power nor love is permissible to be spoken about in polite company. But I've really found that these terms, in the way that I'll define them in a minute, have enormous explanatory value. And much of what I deal with as somebody who works day in and day out with complex social systems made up of nested holons can be explained through an understanding of power and love. And in a sense, what I'm trying to do through that book and through this talk is to rehabilitate two perfectly good words, but which have been misunderstood to apply only in their degenerative sense. I'll explain. The definitions I use of power and love come from a German-American Protestant existential theologian whose name was Paul Tillich, who wrote a book, I think in 1954, called Power, Love, and Justice. And I use these definitions not because I'm particularly interested in German-American Protestant existential theology. I have to say it's not really my thing. But because I find these definitions, as I said, have enormous explanatory value. Tillich defines power as the drive of everything living to realize itself with increasing intensity and extensity. The drive of everything living to realize itself with increasing intensity and extensity. He defines love as the drive to unify the separated. And a lot of what we are trying to understand in observing and working with the social systems can be understood as the interaction of these two drives. Probably the most important thing to understand about these two drives, about power and love, is they represent not a choice, but a polarity. And this is commonly misunderstood. Some people think that the only thing that matters in social systems is power, that love is irrelevant or only important in the private realm or the romantic realm, and other people think that the only thing that matters is love, the only thing that matters is unity, and that the drive of each part to realize itself can be ignored. I find both of these mistakes are made all the time. But there's a very elegant way of thinking about polarity, which I first saw in a book by Barry Johnson, where he uses this example of the polarity between inhaling and exhaling. It's really not a choice between inhaling and exhaling. You can't choose to do one or the other. You have to do them both. They are in a certain sense opposites, and therefore the polarity of inhaling and exhaling is resolved through the sequencing of them. And he has this lovely and simple example that you inhale to get oxygen. At a certain point, there's too much carbon dioxide. Therefore, you exhale to clean out carbon dioxide, but you suffer from too little oxygen. And this is the healthy alternation or cycle between these two poles. I see precisely the same interaction between power and love. And this is the healthy version of the polarity. The healthy version of the polarity, if we start here, is that the generative action of power is to assert or to push, to say, this is what I need, this is what I want, this is what I think is correct. But the reaction that this produces on the part of other actors is resistance or fighting or polarizing. What's needed at this point is to shift to the other side of the pole, to engaging, to collaborating, to embracing. But this also creates a reaction. At a certain point, this collaborating, this embracing is experienced as compromising, as capitulating, as fusing, and therefore produces a reassertion. And this, both of these movements, both asserting and engaging, both fighting and talking, both power and love are legitimate, are necessary, but need to be alternated, or both are required in order for the movement to be generative. What often happens, though, and this is Johnson's point, is you go too far. And we see this over and over. In particular, what we're all familiar with is if the assertion, if the power, if the fighting goes too far, it creates exactly the phenomenon that you alluded to in your introduction. This is what I want, this is what I need, this is what I think, and I'm going to keep pushing no matter what you think. If necessary, I will steamroll over you. If necessary, I will destroy you. So this is not making the movement from power to love, and the result, as we've seen many times, is there is no limit to how bad this can get. I have been involved and watching the situation in Thailand over the last 2.5 months very carefully, and it has really been striking to me the extent to which the government and the opposition are both willing to keep pushing, even at the risk of destroying that which they are trying to achieve. And it's actually only in the last 24 hours that there is potentially a pullback towards engaging or talking. So everybody understands this degenerative side or aspect of power. What not everybody understands is that love or engaging also has a degenerative side, which in a way is even more malignant in that it is not well understood. The degenerative side of love is that the engaging or compromising goes so far that it serves to manipulate or emasculate or to suffocate the other. And I call this one degeneracy is deadly war, and the other degeneracy is deadly peace. So the more complete picture about power and love is to understand that both power and love, that each has two sides. The generative side of power is power to. The degenerative side of power is power over. The generative side of love you could call lifting up love, and the degenerative side of love is falling down love. I once had the pleasure of taking a course with where almost all of my fellow students were from Texas, and the great thing about studying with Texans is they have this wonderful way of, these wonderful expressions in English, and one of them was explained to me that his son had gone to the Netherlands on an exchange program and had fallen in love, and he said, "When my son came home from the Netherlands, he was so in love, he wasn't worth shooting." And this, to me, this is degenerative love. This is love which involves such fusion that actually all of your power, your self-realization is suffocated. The relationship then between power and love is very simple, and the mathematics of the relationship between power and love was precisely summarized by Martin Luther King Jr. in one of his final speeches before he was assassinated. He said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. This clash between immoral power and powerless morality represents the central crisis of our time." So, the reason I have taken the time to explain this model to you is I think it explains very easily why collaboration is difficult. Collaboration is difficult because, in essence, it involves shifting to working at the level of a larger whole. If you and I collaborate, we are the relevant whole is not me or you, the relevant whole is us. And this requires, by definition, compromising or subsuming to some extent my own power, my own drive to self-realization. It involves, to some extent, giving up my own autonomy or control or identity, to some extent, giving up my smaller self for a larger collective self. And we only have to reflect on our own daily experiences at work or in the community or at home to understand why, in many circumstances, this is difficult. Why, then, is collaboration becoming increasingly difficult? I think it's becoming increasingly difficult because social and political and technological changes mean decreasing controls, decreasing solidarity, decreasing trust. In other words, in many Holons, in many contexts, the love drive is weakened. And at the same time, or as a result, we have increasing freedom, increasing autonomy, and increasing voice, which means that the power drive is strengthened. The result is, in many contexts, we are increasingly different from and separated from one another. And we experience the pain of this, the hurt of being in conflict with others, the loneliness of being separated from others. And John Gardner, the American political philosopher, referred to this phenomena some decades ago as the war of the parts against the whole. I've been coming to Singapore on and off for many years and have had many conversations in the last few years about the different kinds of political and social challenges that arise in Singapore as the degree of control or solidarity or trust diminishes as the degree of freedom and autonomy and voice increase. This is not easy to manage. In particular, it's not easy to maintain the whole, in this case, the national whole. So the point is that whereas what we need is a shift to working at the level of larger wholes, what we see in many cases is the opposite, a shift to smaller wholes. The result of these two trends, then, is an increasing gap between what we need to do and what we find we are able to do. And the question that I have been wrestling with and working on with my colleagues is how to close this gap. And it turns out that the answer, as in many of these things, is simple but not easy. In order to deal with this strengthened power drive, what is required is not to weaken the power drive, but rather to strengthen the love drive. And this is important to say because often the reaction, the frightened reaction to the increasing power of the parts is to try to diminish them or control them. This is what you see in authoritarian societies or countries alarmed by the increasing power drive to try to reassert control or censorship or in other ways to restrict. I would suggest that what is actually required is not to diminish that power drive, which is literally the source of all creativity and movement and self-realization, but instead to find ways to strengthen the love drive. And for me, what is crucial here is this is not so much about creating wholeness as it is about revealing wholeness or revealing hidden connections. I know a guy whose name is Drew Jones, who's done very interesting work on climate modeling, who's been interested in environmental matters for many years. And he told me once that when he was at university, he, for 1 week, he carried a large transparent plastic bag around wherever he went on the campus. And in this plastic bag, he put all of the garbage that he was producing through his normal daily activities. And I always found this a wonderful image. It wasn't that he was creating the garbage. He had always been creating the garbage, but it had been hidden. It had been literally thrown away. And all he was doing to himself and to other people at the university was making it visible, making that there is no away, and to make visible this wholeness, these connections that were previously hidden. I'll give you another example of this, or another way of looking at this. When I have looked at the Thai situation, the situation in Thailand over the last months, I think it's helpful to understand that in all of these complex or conflictual situations, the actors always have two choices. They can fight or they can talk. In other words, in my language, they can exercise power or exercise love. And they're both legitimate, they're both helpful, they can both be productive. The problem comes if the talking move, the right-hand column, is shut down, if it's seen to be impossible or too difficult or not productive. If the talking side is shut down, then all that's left is fighting, and in such situations, the degeneracy is potentially unlimited. And in such situations, the way I understand what is required, certainly the way I understand my job, is to help enable the talking, which means lowering the cost and the risk of talking, increasing the productivity and the reliability of talking. So how do we do this? How do we make talking more productive? How do we strengthen the love drive? I'd like to offer three levels of possible answers to that question. And here I'm relying on a very helpful extension of my power and love model that was offered by Barry Oshry. Barry Oshry is a scholar of organizational dynamics, has done wonderful work for many decades, and when he and I spoke about power and love in organizations, he made the very helpful observation that in all organizations there are or in all social systems, there are four processes that are important. Two of them can be labeled power processes, and two of them can be labeled love processes. And his studies of organizational systems, I would make the same argument about other social systems, tell us that we need to have a balance of these two sets of forces. The two power forces he labels individuation and differentiation, and the two love forces he labels homogenization and integration. And all four are useful, but they have to be in balance. So the question I have, if we're talking about how to make talking more productive, how to strengthen the love drive, in other words, that is, how do we strengthen homogenization and integration functions in social systems? So here are three ways of thinking about this, or three avenues for work in this area. The first is at the level of changing structures. In other words, what structures can be put in place to facilitate wholeness? In general, this is about governance or management structures at the level of larger wholes. When Peter Ho spoke this morning about the effort of the Singaporean government to deal with the, governance challenges not only at the level of individual department or individual agency, but at the level of whole of government, this is an example of such a structural attempt to facilitate wholeness. The obvious difficulty in dealing with supranational challenges, of which the example we're all familiar with is climate change, is the weakness of such supranational structures. One approach that my colleagues and I have been working on for many years is this so-called social lab approach. My partner Zaid Hassan has just a few days ago published an excellent book called The Social Lab's Revolution, and the essence of a social lab is that it is a space for all stakeholders to work together, not just to talk, not just to make proposals, but to develop solutions in practice, to pilot, to manage a portfolio of options in order to address the problem. So this is a structural solution to the problem of fragmentation, polarization, individuation, and differentiation. And an example that I've worked on with Alain Wouters 10 years ago, and that has been going ever since, is the Sustainable Food Lab, which brings together food companies, environmental groups, farmer groups, governmental agencies to work together on piloting and managing a portfolio of promising solutions related to sustainable supply chains. So this is an example of creating a structure that facilitates wholeness, in this case, the wholeness, working on the wholeness of food systems. A second avenue to look at would be to look at the stories we tell about the world we're in. And to what extent do the stories we tell reveal or conceal wholeness, interconnection, and interdependence? When I moved to South Africa in 1993 and acquired 4 stepchildren, teenage stepchildren, I was really struck by the extent to which, in that generation, even in a country which had lots of other concerns, there was such awareness of environmental matters and global environmental interdependence and interconnection. So this is an example of the story we tell, the story many of us, many people around the world, tell ourselves about the situation we're in, being one that recognizes or reveals wholeness. The other example I would give is that I have been involved in the last 20 years in perhaps 20 national dialogues using the scenario method that I learned at Shell, and very different situations: Argentina, Guatemala, South Africa, Sudan, India, Canada, huge differences. But there is one common theme in all of these scenarios, I think almost without exception. There's almost always one scenario which has as its characteristic a future of a bottom-up or a horizontal way of dealing with challenges. And one of the first examples of this was from a set of scenarios in Guatemala prepared after the end of the terrible civil war, which involved the genocide of indigenous people in Guatemala. And when they talked about the third and best scenario being the scenario called the flight of the firefly, this was a scenario where Guatemalans were no longer looking to the leader on top, the illusion of the moth, but were recognizing in themselves and in each other their own light, or what I would say their own power, their own drive to self-realization. And how could this kind of horizontal way, a story about such a horizontal society, be positive? And the third avenue I would suggest for making talking more productive, for strengthening the love drive, is something that each of us can do ourselves, and can ask ourselves, in what way is the way we are showing up, the way we are engaging with others at work, in the community, at home, to what extent is the way we are showing up revealing or concealing wholeness? And this is a model from Otto Scharmer, actually based in part, one of you referred to him, to the work of Francisco Varela, which makes the point that if we try to think about social interaction and work, how we are in social systems in the simplest terms, in terms of how do we talk and how do we listen, we can become aware that there is not simply one way to talk and one way to listen, but a taxonomy of ways of talking and listening. The most frequent kind of talking and listening is downloading. Downloading is where I'm just saying what I always say, either because I'm afraid to say anything else or because I think that the reality in my head is the only reality there is. The kind of listening associated with downloading is, I'm not listening, I'm just waiting for your mouth to stop moving so that I can go back to telling you the way things are. The second kind of talking and listening is debating, where I'm saying what I think, you're saying what you think, one of us is right. So the kind of listening is associated with debating is judging. The third kind of talking and listening in this model is dialoguing. The key is that I'm not only saying what I think, but I'm explaining where it's coming from. And I'm not only listening to you to decide whether I agree with you, I'm listening to you to try to understand why is this person saying what they're saying? Where is this person coming from? And the fourth kind of talking and listening, the subject of this book by Senge, Sharma, Jaworski, and Flowers, presencing, relates to the kind of listening where we're listening not to you, not just for what it says about what you think, but what it might reveal about the emerging whole of the situation. And Francisco Varela's words for these transitions are extremely powerful. The transition from downloading to debating is suspending. This idea that I take my ideas about the way things are and I hang them as if from a string in front of me. I'm aware it's just my thoughts. You can attack them without attacking me. The second transition being redirecting, seeing from within the other with empathy, and the third transition being letting go. And I have found over and over in groups dealing with the most complex and conflictual contexts, these simple moves, and especially this first move of suspending, is extraordinarily powerful in allowing both a recognition of wholeness and a way to work together to creatively enact something new rather than simply reenacting the old over and over. So all these three ways, the structural way, this story way, this way of the self, these are all ways to reveal hidden connections. These are all ways to make collaboration less difficult. These are all ways to narrow the gap between what we are able to do and what we need to do. Thank you very much. I would love to have your comments, your questions, your observations. Please.
As somebody who has worked in trying to break down silos inside a government, a very large government, at least the government of the United States, I am very interested in how you develop trust, because one of the things that we have found is that in competing systems, and frequently stakeholders in something like a large government or even a small government perceive themselves as competing with one another for things like resources and so on. How do you produce collaborative partnerships, even within an institution, between different departments?
You've raised a very important question, and so in general I'd like to take a few questions, but I want to answer this one directly because I think in a way it gets to one of the most frequent difficulties and misunderstandings in this field. So I am interested in collaboration, and it's my professional interest, my personal interest, my life work. But after a while, I realized that focusing only on that was ignoring half the picture. So to take a very typical example, imagine a room of people from different departments, different units of an organization, and there is a facilitator. Now, there's only one person in the room for whom the collaboration amongst these units is perfectly aligned with their own personal interests. And who is that? The facilitator. So facilitators are always saying, why don't you just collaborate? Why can't you leave your agendas at the door? And this betrays, for me, what is a very frequent misunderstanding, which I think, if I could guess, might even have been the misunderstanding in the missing S in the Weaver article. And that is that to ask people to leave their agendas at the door, to ask people to not consider their own interests, is a completely illegitimate interest. They may believe they're competing for resources because they are competing for resources. And to not recognize that, that's why facilitators or organizers of these processes, when somebody says, you're manipulating me, what's the manipulation? The manipulation is trying to get me to believe that my interests don't matter or that I can put them aside. So the reason I'm emphasizing this, first of all, it's a very frequent misunderstanding, and it's a very frequent misunderstanding in policy formulation. My early training was in energy policy, environmental policy. Almost 100% of that training asked the question, what's best for the whole? Which of course is a very important question. But to only ask what's good for the whole and ignore what's good for the parts, or in the Holonic language, to only ask what's good for the larger whole and ignore what's good for the smaller wholes, is illegitimate and ultimately oppressive. So for me, this has to be the starting point, to recognize that there are both interests or reasons or logics to thinking about the whole, and interests, reasons, logics for thinking about the parts. Once those are all discussable, once they're on the table, then it's possible to make progress. I once had somebody say to me, I've worked in many kind of organizations, and the hardest organizations to work in are healthcare organizations. Because as soon as you're really getting down to the difficult issues about power and doctors versus nurses versus administrators, somebody will say, remember the patients. Well, nobody had ever forgotten the patients. But it's a distracting comment. Remember the whole. And that's a distraction from looking at the other part of the story. So I'm not trying to, there are real challenges and structural issues involved in collaboration, which I think is essential. It's what I spent all my time working on. But I think it's crucial to never make the mistake of saying, leave your interests at the door. It's a completely illegitimate request. Please, Dr. Arthur. Are you yet regretting having recommended me?
I'm very proud of it, Adam. I thought that was a tremendous talk. Thank you. I have a question, and that is, you mentioned Paul Tillich a couple of times, and I'm wondering what exactly was it in what Tillich had to say that so deeply interested you? What's the influence of Paul Tillich on you?
When I started to, I became interested, I had the idea of working on power and love, or thinking about it, because this quote from Martin Luther King really struck me, that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. And there was something about that sentence that struck me as worth digging, and I discovered that King had written his doctoral dissertation on two theologians. I can't remember the second one, but the first one was Tillich. So I found Tillich's book, which is called Power, Love, and Justice, which in general is quite an impenetrable tome. I don't know anything about theology. Interestingly, there was a lot of writing using those words in the 1950s, and the two literatures that used power and love a lot were theology and psychology. But there was two things about Tillich that struck me. The first was simply these two definitions, that the more I worked with power as the drive of every living thing to realize itself, and love as the drive to unite the separated, I found that it was really easy to connect, or really straightforward to connect those definitions to the behavior of social holons at all scales. And so even though in the literature there are many other definitions of power and love, completely different definitions, I found that everything I was trying to or almost many things I was trying to understand were explained by the interaction between these two drives, the way he defined them. So it's nothing more than that. But the second thing, which I am interested in but really still don't understand at all, is that, in fact, the title of his book is not Power and Love, but Power, Love, and Justice. And I think there is a third axis here, which I don't understand well, and which I continue to carry as a question in my mind. There's a way, I think the way to put it is, power and love alone do not have any teleology. I think that's the word. There's no directionality. And that there's a lot of things that can't be explained without some sense of direction. Just looking at power and love seems a bit static. And so I think it's an incomplete theory, and I'm curious about what the third thing is.
I've just left the world, the diplomatic world, and actually am in the corporate world, which overvalues, in my view, that which can be measured. And much of what's happened today actually is a function of what can we measure and how valuable it would be if we could measure everything. But we can't. And oftentimes I've found the adaptive adversaries in the worlds that I've inhabited have demanded proofs for those things which cannot be measured. And I've wondered often as to whether there are demands that they be given such proof before they accept certain approaches is genuine, or rather it's just a deflection.
Right.
I've concluded, and it's not a final conclusion by any means, I've begun to believe that ultimately they're demanding these proofs because they don't feel that the risks that they are running, if we don't provide them, are their risks.
Right.
The risks belong to someone else. And often those risks that those who are most at risk are those yet to come, those who are not in the room, the next generation or the generation after that. So many of the problems that you're addressing in terms of a dispute on a border or a conflict, a social conflict or political conflict, in trying to get sides to agree on something, I understand that process and what you've described. But in those situations where adaptive adversaries are demanding proofs that cannot be given because we cannot measure the things they demand be measured, what is the application for this approach in that context? And I guess I'm talking about such larger issues such as climate change and things such as this, as we try to constitute conversations that actually might begin to address these things. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's has occurred to me.
Well, I've worked on and off on climate change for a long time. When I went to Berkeley, my professor was John Holdren, who had been thinking about that already for several decades. And in a way, climate change is in many obvious ways, is the great, I don't know what the right word is, the one that stumps us. Because in particular, the stories about climate change have been told for so long. It's not as though nobody's talked about scenarios or stories, or it's not as though there's no understanding about the interconnection and interdependence, the way in which the weather and productivity and economic well-being of Africa is related to coal plants in China. This, if anything, this is the most developed set of narratives around, global narratives around. And similarly, there's been lots of work, very outstanding work, on international institutions. I remember going to the Copenhagen COP 15, I guess it was, and being, on balance, very impressed at the sophistication and dedication of the diplomatic and technical activity. So this is one of these situations where all the obvious ways forward are being tried, and at least to date are not succeeding, or not succeeding sufficiently. Part of the reason I've explained things the way I have is, as I said in response to your question, it's helpful to start with the understanding that there's something intrinsically difficult about collaboration. And to say, why can't you just get together and work it out, is an unreasonable request. There are real differences in interests, whether within an organization or within international climate negotiations. And so I don't have an easy answer for that. I do find that but the formula I am working on is the one I mentioned, which is what can be done to increase the benefits and increase the reliability of collaborative efforts and reduce their cost and their risk. To recognize that there are real costs and real risks, and so to find ways, whether it has to do with the structure of negotiations or the psychology of negotiations, which doesn't ignore those costs and risks, but that tries to switch. In a way, we can get discouraged if we refer to the climate change as it is in the climate change challenge, as it is in all dimensions, the most difficult. But to take the example that's on my mind a lot, I have been interested at the self-correcting cycle going on amongst political parties in Thailand this last week, that there is now enough sense that we risk bringing down the whole show, everything we hold most dear, economically, culturally, in terms of nationhood, is at risk now, and therefore lots of, you can call them mediating forces, have been brought to bear, and maybe we'll see the situation can be righted. So there's lots of successful examples, but they always require these two sides. Now, interestingly enough, this is very well understood in the diplomatic world and the business world. And James Hillman has made the important, what I think is the very helpful point, that in a way power is used most cleanly in the worlds where it is understood and discussable, especially politics and business. But it's the worlds where you're not allowed to talk about power, healthcare, spiritual organizations, academia perhaps, where the effects are most perverse. So the fact that the love people think power is bad and the power people think that love is irrelevant, this polarization is very unhelpful. And all I'm trying to do is put them both in the same picture and to understand the interaction between them. Sir.
Could I ask you to elaborate a bit about your remarks on Thailand? You made several here. In particular, what's the relevance, how efficient will your framework be in your, just now you're saying that there's a change there, that the parties in Thailand are realizing that the risk. What brought about this change? You know, how would you diagnose the future of Thailand here using your framework?
Well, I don't want to make any forecasts, as I've been working in Thailand on these matters for several years, and I'm constantly surprised by what happens. So I'm not going to make a forecast, but I will make an explanation, which is, without going into details which might not be of interest, there are serious and deep-rooted and long-standing conflicts along several dimensions: political, cultural, economic, personal. This is all a stew of conflict. And what's become clear to me, particularly in the last 3 months since the occupation of Bangkok started on November 30th, is that every day the actors have this choice. Are we going to fight or are we going to talk? And it's played out very visibly, literally in public. And the dynamic has been, we will fight. And in fact, at least the declared positions of the two parties is, we will destroy the other. That's why I found this in Sulza quote. I read this in Sulza the quote that Jose Miguel Insulza made about Venezuela, I read 4 times last week in Thailand because I think it's so appropriate. In situations of high conflict, parties often believe that there's no way of working things out with my adversary. Anyhow, I don't like them and trust them. It's best that they just go away, and if they won't go away, I'll make them go away. And what gets caught up in this, particularly in the dynamic of street protests, is what Insulza refers to the apparent heroism of victory. That's the better option is to destroy my opponent. And I am amazed the number of situations where that is the driving belief, including but not limited to Thailand. We could probably, amongst us, think of 100 other examples where the actors believe that the best solution is to defeat or destroy or to otherwise make the opponent go away. And so the reason I use the Thai example, in addition to it being current, is it seems obvious to me that the risk of that strategy is to destroy that which, that the actors will lose that which they are trying to gain. I have a friend, James Guinean, who spent his whole life studying one book, which is Sun Tzu's Art of War, and made a beautiful new translation of The Art of War called the Demna translation, published by Shambhala Press. And when Jim discusses the historical context for that book, I'm summarizing something that is much more complicated than I'm about to say, but that the historical context was in the war between, or in the conflicts between warring provinces or warlords for territory in China of that period, what became very clear is that if you really destroy your opponent, you will destroy the productive capacity and the agricultural capacity of the territory you're trying to gain. So the central challenge of that book is, how do I achieve victory without destroying that which I am attempting to gain? And this is what I see so clearly in Thailand, or for that matter, in global warming. We risk, and this is the risk everybody in this room is aware of, we risk destroying, I mean, the obvious and ultimate risk of climate change, which is why we are also compelled by the difficulty, is that we are at a very serious risk, and I think you made this point, of destroying the basis on which all our economies and societies and happiness rests. And this is a terrible, terrible thing, that the strategies we are using to gain something will ultimately destroy that which we are trying to gain. And the question I'm asking, I don't think at all I have even 5% of an answer yet, is how to make that visible, how to make these hidden connections visible so that we can change course. And in particular, how to make the connections how to make the parts of the system that are far away in space and time, that seem to belong to the other, that seem to belong to the unknown, how to make those connections, which are genuinely hidden or largely hidden, how to make them visible, not just visible intellectually, but felt enough to shift action. And so this is the question. I don't know the answer, but that's the question I'm wrestling with, and why I was taken with this hidden connections. When I was in Copenhagen, I was there with my friend Earl Saxon, who is a climatologist. And it's a little unsettling to wander around international climate negotiations with a climatologist. He kept muttering under his breath, "You can't negotiate with Mother Earth." In other words, the connections, the fact that you ignore the connections doesn't mean they're not there. This is very important. You can pretend the connections are not there, but that doesn't make them go away. And in particular, he was referring to the connections between the behavior of humans and national governments on the one hand, and what happens to ecosystems and weather systems on the other. So the point about interconnection, interdependence, the point about wholeness, the point about unity, the point about love, is you can ignore it, you can pretend it doesn't matter, but that doesn't mean it doesn't matter. It just means it'll come and get you later. And that's why I think, at least conceptually, the clue is to reveal hidden connections. Sir.
Thank you. Now, collaboration becomes easy if there's a culture of collaboration, for example, among the Japanese. I mean, that's well known. But when two parties are in conflict and when one of them is stronger, why would the one which is winning want to collaborate? They wouldn't, because they are winning. And we have seen lots of cases in the world. And the only way that collaboration can happen is when the weak one is empowered to be at least not necessarily equal, but to be able to offer a solution which would not be attainable without that collaboration. So what can be done in this regard? Thank you.
You want to ask your question? Go ahead, yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. While you were speaking, I was thinking to ask you, how does your theory fit in the discussion on the two first books of Plato about justice that you are putting in relation between power and love? And second, maybe following him, is this discussion that is going on in Asia and in Singapore as well since, I think, 10 years ago, on switching from the art of war to the art of collaboration, using the Chinese diplomacy, starting from the 15th century from Zhang He, the admiral of the Chinese fleet, which was the hugest fleet in the world. They could have conquered all the Indian Ocean, but they decided to use it for diplomatic relations. Thank you.
I'll come to both questions, but let me start with the second. I don't know the literatures you're referring to, or I don't know them well enough to comment on them. So I don't think I know the answer to your question. In the little understanding I have of the book, The Art of War, at least the Demna translation, the war referred to is not necessarily or only the external war, but the internal war. What is the interior conditions required in order to achieve victory without aggression or achieve victory without destroying? But beyond that, it's above my pay grade. I would refer you to, for any further questions, to Brian Arthur. The question you raise about collaboration in contexts of unequal power is very important, very important. And I learned that the hard way in India, in fact. I mean, the following story could have been told in many countries, but it became clear to me in India that you can have a diverse group of actors who sit in a circle apparently equal, but that doesn't mean they think of themselves as equal or that they act as equal. And it was that experience, that very difficult and painful experience in India, which made me understand that this idea that love without power is sentimental and anemic. It's never love without power, it's love denying power. Just like it's never power without love, it's power denying love or interconnection. So the first answer to your question is, this has to be discussable. And to pretend that there are not power differences is manipulative. It's anemic and manipulative, and at worst, cynically reproduces the status quo. I've discussed this particular issue a lot with reference to the Israel-Palestine issue. There's lots of levels to that, and there's lots of Holons involved in that. But amongst the people who work on the Israel-Palestine level of the Holon, this is the main question. How can this be a negotiation if the Israelis are so much more powerful than the Palestinians? The formula was given me by a Palestinian mediator who spends part of his time mediating political matters and other part of his time mediating marital disputes. And he said his formula in marital disputes is support the weak and bring the strong to their senses. Sorry, I'm not quoting him precisely. He said it a little better than that. But that's the function of a third party, is on the one hand to maybe not empower, but create a space where the weaker party is able to participate fully and use what influence the third party has to bring the strong to their senses. What does bring the strong to their senses means? It actually means the same things we've been discussing, helping them see the possible unintended consequences of their attempt to defeat or to force their solution on their opponent. Now, like everything, this is easy to say and hard to do, and every attempt along these lines in that particular context have failed. But it is important to realize that collaboration in contexts of large power differentials is almost impossible. And when we started the Food Lab, there was one group, there were several groups that didn't agree to participate, but the one I remember, we had a long meeting with Via Campesina, which is a global peasant movement. We met with their European representative, and he was very interested in the Food Lab, in this collaboration. He gave us 2 days. We were at his farmhouse. We spoke about this potential collaboration, and after 2 days, he said, "Thank you very much, but we will decline to participate because we're not strong enough yet. Give us another few years to build up our strength so that we can be taken seriously, and then we'll join." And I thought that was a highly rational approach. The other side of that, which you have alluded to, and this is the other side of the power equation. Why would I collaborate with people I don't know or understand or like if I didn't have to? I wouldn't. It's very annoying and time-consuming and gets in the way. So this is, I come over and over to the same point, which is to only focus on the larger whole, to only focus on wholeness, interconnection, love, is a terrible error. And you have to start, or you have to take account of the drive to self-realization of every part or every whole in itself. And if I can get what I want without collaborating, if I can get what I want just by pushing forward, I will, or at least almost everybody will. And that has to be understood. Otherwise, as King said, love denying power is sentimental and anemic. And many, perhaps most attempts at collaboration fall into this trap and are sentimental and anemic.
Well, Adam, thank you very much. Now, the point here, the missing link, I would appreciate very much if we could connect that. The question is that the rule of physics is clear-cut.
The role of?
Physics. The law of physics.
Yeah. Physics.
Yeah. In terms of technology.
Yeah.
But when you come to social justice, politics, there is none. So the question is that when you're trying to bridge the gap, the question is that even in the in the industry, when we talk about open innovation, not really that they subscribe to what they just propose, or it's very much a slogan. So the question is that managing the two differentiation in your context, because for example, okay, let's say your co-partner just got 400 million pound DeepMind, Google's buying it because Google couldn't beat you. Okay, they bought over 400 million. It's a lot of money. Now, the question is that is very clear-cut. But in terms of politics, too often you find political leaders are coward. Look at the WTO. You look at the currency problem. You look at any climate change for that. See, leaders are not willing to change. And that is the problem that is existing. and it's got to be embedded. So how do you overcome that? Just you mentioned Thailand, Singapore, everywhere else. It's the same thing. Thanks.
Maybe I'll take one last question, and then I'll answer those two together. I'll come to that, yeah. Madam? There's a hand there. Yeah.
Hi, I just want to ask a question, I guess, about the dynamics of the model, maybe. What use is it to try and make a generative cycle from your larger holon if you have hopelessly degenerative holons within it? So like maybe if you, what use is it to try to solve a national problem if you have issues within the different communities that you can't solve yet?
Is there a last question? And I'll deal with the three of them. Okay. So the model I'm offering is a way of understanding social systems. I didn't realize until the conference started this morning the obvious similarity between describing social systems as composed of nested holons on the one side and the large literature, which I don't really understand at all, about agent-based modeling, etc. So I would be interested in the coming days in learning about how those two pictures might connect. But what I have attempted to do is to describe some of the simple dynamics that explain many of these phenomena, surprisingly simple, actually, and maybe there's some work that can be done there on is it really so, as I'm hypothesizing, that the behavior of enormously complex social systems can be explained by these two drives. I mean, it starts to sound like the kind of models that others of you are describing. I don't know the answer to that question from a computational point of view. But this is a description more than or it's a diagnosis more than a prescription, and I'm trying to understand the categories of interventions that are useful, and then I and my colleagues are working on one very particular approach, this so-called social lab approach of bringing together actors in a particular system to work together, not just to talk about the problem, but to act on it. And a number of people in the room work in this way, and it's, I think, quite promising. That said, any question, and I get this question often, that starts with the words, how can you make ... to me there's no, this is not productive. I can't make anybody do anything. I can't even make my kids do anything. I can barely make myself do anything. It's really it's really, to me, the wrong place to start. So I start in another place, and this comes a bit to your question as well. I'm looking for opportunities where the actors have already figured out that what they're doing is not working and are wondering, is there another way? I'm not sure that I can get where I want to go, they're saying, by simply acting unilaterally or attempting to have power over other actors. Once that has occurred, then there's a lot we can do. But until that has occurred, there's certainly nothing I can do. So now the good news is, if you can call it that, there are many situations in the world, large and small, where people are seeing this. Or they may not be seeing it, they may not be admitting it, but they have the doubt. They doubt, is what we're doing going to work? And maybe we should be willing to open up some other kind of approach. And that's what I see as a workable situation. But I don't expend any energy at all on trying to convince people to do things that they don't have any interest in doing. On this question of the lower level degeneracy, I guess I would say that in these situations, sequencing seems less important than you might think. So it's not always true that until the parts are healthy, the whole can't be healthy. So I guess my approach in general is to start where there is energy, start where there is frustration or doubt. Sometimes work at the level of the larger whole can provide support, can provide an opening, or the resources, or the space to help the smaller whole. The famous example, which is maybe overly topical right now, but as many people have said, the strengthening of Europe as an entity, as a supranational entity, provides more avenues for subnational entities, and we'll see the extent to which this is true in the Scottish referenda. So I'm just making the point that it's not always true that one has to first work at any given level before one can go to another level. And if there are problems at the level, in your example, if there are problems or challenges or issues that have to be dealt with at the national level, those can be approached or can be worked on even while there are dysfunctions or degeneracies at the subnational level. And so the main point about this observation about Holons is to become aware that we're always dealing with multiple levels. I'm surprised this word Holon is not more widely used. It seems to me an obvious observation about organic systems. And much of the confusion in this field is because people are not clear about which Holon they're referring to. Having now confused this matter further, I think I'll quit while I'm behind. Thank you very much.